September 8, 1941, German artillery opened fire on Leningrad and the siege began. It would last 872 days, 2 years, 4 months, and 19 days of starvation, bombardment, and death. By the time Soviet forces broke the siege in January 1944, over 1 million civilians had died, most from hunger and cold. The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the longest, deadliest sieges in human history, a monument to human suffering and endurance. But here's what makes it strategically fascinating: it should have worked. Germany's plan to besiege Leningrad was militarily sound. Encircle the city, cut it off from supplies, starve it into submission. Don't waste troops attacking fortified positions, just wait for hunger to do the work. It was cost-effective, logical, achievable. German forces had the firepower, had the position, had every military advantage. The city should have surrendered within months, maybe weeks. 3 million people cannot survive without food, and Leningrad was cut off from all land-based supply routes. By every calculation, the siege should have succeeded. Instead, it failed, catastrophically consuming German resources, tying down entire armies, accomplishing nothing strategic, while costing everything moral. The Siege of Leningrad failed not because the Germans didn't have enough firepower or couldn't maintain the encirclement. They had both. It failed because of logistical overreach that left German forces unable to sustain operations, weather that turned siege lines into frozen nightmares, Soviet resilience that refused to break despite unimaginable suffering, and Nazi ideology that made humanitarian compromise impossible. This is the story of why Germany's most ambitious siege failed, despite overwhelming military advantages, and why that failure reveals fundamental truths about the limits of military power. The strategic importance of Leningrad was never in question. The city, founded by Peter the Great as Russia's window to Europe, was the Soviet Union's second largest city, with a population of approximately 3 million people. It was a major industrial center, producing tanks, artillery ships, and munitions. It was the home of the Baltic Fleet, which threatened German naval operations. It was a cultural symbol, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, named after Lenin himself, representing everything the Soviet state claimed to be. Hitler wanted Leningrad destroyed, not just captured. His directive was explicit. The city should be wiped from the face of the earth, its population eliminated through starvation, its buildings reduced to rubble. This wasn't military strategy. It was ideological warfare, genocide, disguised as siege tactics. And that ideological imperative would doom the entire operation from the start. German forces approached Leningrad in summer 1941 as part of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, advanced through the Baltic states, driving back Soviet forces, capturing territory at speeds that seemed to validate German confidence. By late August, German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad. On September 8th, German artillery cut the last land route into the city, completing the encirclement. Leningrad was besieged. From the German perspective, the situation looked favorable. The city was isolated, its defenders were outnumbered, and starvation was inevitable. German commanders estimated the city would fall within weeks. Some optimistic assessments suggested the population would surrender even sooner once food ran out. What those assessments failed to account for was everything that would actually determine the siege's outcome. The first problem was logistical overreach. German forces had advanced over 500 miles from their starting positions in East Prussia, moving faster than their supply lines could support. Army Group North's logistics were stretched impossibly thin. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Railroads were different gauge and needed conversion fuel shortages. Limited mobility, ammunition stocks were inadequate for sustained operations. The Wehrmacht was designed for rapid mobile warfare, for breakthrough and exploitation, not for sustained siege operations that required constant supply of artillery, ammunitions, food, for besieging troops, fuel for vehicles, and replacement equipment. German forces around Leningrad needed thousands of tons of supplies daily, but supply columns were delivering far less. Units were on reduced rations. Artillery battalions rationed ammunition. Mechanized units couldn't maneuver because fuel was limited. The German military machine that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months was running on empty, trying to maintain a siege perimeter around a city of 3 million people, while simultaneously defending against Soviet counterattacks and preparing for winter. It was logistically impossible, but German command either didn't recognize this or didn't care. Hitler's interference made everything worse. Rather than concentrating forces to capture Leningrad decisively, Hitler diverted Army Group North's best units, particularly its panzer divisions south toward Moscow. The Moscow offensive was Hitler's priority, and Leningrad was relegated to secondary importance. This meant German forces besieging Leningrad were simultaneously weakened and still expected to achieve the same objectives. They were supposed to maintain encirclement, repel Soviet breakout attempts, conduct bombardment, and somehow force surrender, all while under strength and undersupplied. It was mission impossible disguised as strategic planning. The result was stalemate. German forces weren't strong enough to assault the city. Urban warfare against prepared defences would cost casualties Germany couldn't afford, but they weren't willing to withdraw either. They were committed to a siege they couldn't sustain, locked into position by Hitler's orders and institutional momentum. The Soviet response to encirclement was immediate and comprehensive. Leningrad's population began building fortifications, trenches, anti-tank ditches, bunkers, barricades. Factories were converted to weapons production. Every capable person was mobilized. Children filled sandbags, elderly citizens dug trenches, women manned anti-aircraft guns. The city transformed into a fortress, not through military planning, but through desperate civilian effort. Soviet military command in Leningrad, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, in the critical early months organized the defense with ruthless efficiency. Forces that might have retreated were ordered to hold or die. Counterattacks were launched not to break the siege, but to keep German forces engaged, to prevent them from consolidating positions, to demonstrate that Leningrad would fight. The defense was improvised, chaotic, often suicidal, but it worked. German forces never penetrated the city center, never captured key industrial facilities, never broke the defensive perimeter. The city held, and as long as it held, the siege continued. The supply situation inside Leningrad was catastrophic from the beginning. The city had stockpiled some food, but nowhere near enough for 3 million people for an indefinite period. When the siege began, Leningrad had perhaps 2 months of food at full rations. Soviet authorities immediately instituted rationing, cutting daily allowances to levels barely sufficient for survival. Workers received more food than dependents. Soldiers received more than civilians. Children, elderly and unemployed received starvation rations, 4 ounces of bread per day, made from flour mixed with sawdust, cellulose and whatever else could provide bulk. People ate wallpaper paste made from flour. They ate leather belts boiled into jelly. They ate pets, birds' rats. They ate things that shouldn't be eaten and paid for it with dysentery and poisoning. Starvation became the primary cause of death. Bodies appeared on streets daily, people who had collapsed from hunger and frozen to death overnight. Burial became impossible when the ground froze. Bodies were stacked in warehouses covered with snow, left until spring when they could be properly interred. The only supply route into Leningrad was Lake Ladoga, the massive lake east of the city. During summer, boats could carry supplies across the lake. During winter, when the lake froze, trucks could drive across the ice. This became known as the Road of Life, the lifeline that kept Leningrad alive. But the Road of Life was inadequate, dangerous, and constantly attacked. German artillery shelled the lake. Luftwaffe bombers attacked supply convoys. The ice was unreliable. Trucks broke through and sank, drowning drivers and losing cargo. Weather interfered. Storms made crossing impossible. Fog grounded aircraft that provided cover. Even under ideal conditions, the Road of Life couldn't supply enough food for 3 million people. It could barely supply enough for the garrison and a fraction of the civilian population. The result was calculated triage, who received enough food to survive and who was condemned to slow death by starvation. Soviet authorities made those decisions coldly, prioritizing military personnel, factory workers, Communist Party members, and children. Everyone else received rations insufficient for survival. Over 600,000 people died during the winter of 1941 to 42 alone, almost all from starvation and starvation-related disease. German strategy assumed starvation would break the city's will to resist. This was a fundamental miscalculation rooted in Nazi ideology that viewed Soviet citizens as subhuman, incapable of the resilience and determination Germans possessed. Nazi ideology taught that Slavic peoples were inferior, that Soviet communism was weak and corrupt, that Russian civilians would surrender rather than endure suffering. Every assumption was wrong. Leningrad's population didn't surrender. They didn't riot or revolt. They endured. Mothers watched children starve. Families buried loved ones. People ate food that barely qualified as edible. And they kept working, kept fighting, kept surviving. Factories continued producing weapons, even when workers were literally dying at their stations from hunger. Anti-aircraft batteries continued firing when crews could barely stand. Soldiers held positions on frozen perimeters with inadequate clothing, insufficient food, and no hope of relief. The assumption that suffering would break Soviet resistance was not just wrong, it was the opposite of reality. Suffering strengthened resistance because surrender offered nothing. Nazi Germany's stated intention was to eliminate Leningrad's population. Surrender meant death anyway, probably faster and more brutal. Fighting offered at least the possibility of survival, the dignity of resistance, the hope that relief might come eventually. So they fought. Winter was the factor neither side fully anticipated, but which determined everything. The winter of 1941 to 42 was exceptionally harsh. Temperatures dropped to -30. Celsius snowdrifts buried vehicles and fortifications. Visibility was measured in meters during blizzards. German forces besieging Leningrad were not prepared for Russian winter. Wehrmacht logistics hadn't prioritized winter clothing because Operation Barbarossa was supposed to end before winter arrived. German soldiers froze in inadequate uniforms. Vehicles wouldn't start engines, froze. Batteries died. Fuel gelled. Weapons malfunctioned. Rifles seized up. Machine guns, jammed artillery mechanisms froze solid. German forces spent the winter trying to survive, not fighting. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Entire units became combat ineffective simply from cold. The siege line became a static, frozen nightmare, where German soldiers huddled in dugouts trying not to freeze to death, where movement was limited to survival necessities, where offensive operations were impossible. Winter neutralized every German advantage. Artillery couldn't fire effectively when mechanisms froze. Armor couldn't maneuver on ice and through snowdrifts. Infantry couldn't assault when movement meant frostbite. The siege that was supposed to starve Leningrad into submission became a mutual endurance test where both sides suffered, but only one side could be resupplied across Lake Ladoga once the ice formed. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was desperate improvisation that saved the city. In November 1941, the lake began freezing. Soviet engineers tested the ice thickness and determined trucks could cross when ice reached certain depths. They laid out roads marked with stakes, established traffic control, organized convoys. The first trucks crossed on November 20th, carrying flour and other supplies into Leningrad and evacuating civilians on return trips. It was terrifying. Drivers couldn't see where they were going in darkness or blizzards. Ice cracked under vehicle weight. German artillery fired on routes identified by observation. Hundreds of trucks broke through the ice and sank. Drivers who survived often froze to death in the water before rescue came. But the convoys continued. Every truck that made it through carried food that kept people alive. Over 150,000 tons of supplies crossed Lake Ladoga during the winter of 1941 to 42. And while that was insufficient to prevent mass starvation, it was enough to prevent complete catastrophe. The road of life demonstrated Soviet determination and logistical creativity. They accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible, supplying a besieged city of 3 million across a frozen lake under enemy fire. It was inefficient, inadequate, and catastrophically costly. It was also the only reason Leningrad survived. German attempts to take Leningrad by assault were limited and unsuccessful. In September and October 1941, German forces launched several attacks trying to penetrate the city's defences. All were repelled with heavy casualties on both sides. Urban warfare negated German advantages in mobile warfare and combined arms tactics. Fighting in cities is infantry-intensive, requires house-to-house clearing, produces massive casualties for minimal gain. German command recognized that assaulting Leningrad would cost tens of thousands of casualties and might still fail. The decision was made to rely on starvation rather than assault to let hunger do what artillery and infantry couldn't. This was militarily rational but strategically flawed. Starvation takes time, requires maintaining siege lines through winter, ties down forces that could be used elsewhere. Every month the siege continued was a month German divisions remained committed to a static position instead of fighting mobile campaigns. The opportunity cost was enormous. Army Group North's forces, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of artillery pieces, hundreds of tanks, were frozen in position around Leningrad, while the war's decisive battles were fought elsewhere. Those forces might have made the difference at Moscow, at Stalingrad, on any of a dozen battlefields where German offensives stalled for lack of reserves. Instead, they sat around Leningrad, shelling a city that wouldn't surrender, accomplishing nothing. Soviet counterattacks were constant throughout the siege. Soviet forces inside Leningrad and outside the siege perimeter launched attacks, attempting to break through German lines and lift the siege. The most significant was Operation Iskra in January 1943, which finally broke the siege by establishing a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. The corridor was only a few miles wide, constantly under German artillery fire, but it allowed supplies and reinforcements to reach Leningrad by rail rather than depending entirely on Lake Ladoga. The siege wasn't fully lifted until January 1944, when Soviet forces drove German troops away from the city in a massive offensive that finally ended the encirclement. For German forces, the counterattacks were costly defensive battles that consumed resources and prevented any possibility of offensive action. They were fighting a defensive war around Leningrad, while simultaneously conducting offensive operations elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The logistical and manpower strain was unsustainable. Nazi ideology made the Siege of Leningrad uniquely brutal and ultimately self-defeating. Hitler's directive was not to capture Leningrad, but to eliminate it. German forces were ordered not to accept surrender even if offered. Civilians attempting to escape through German lines were to be fired upon. Food shipments were to be prevented from entering the city by any means necessary. The goal was extermination through starvation, genocide by siege. This ideological imperative prevented any possibility of negotiated settlement or humanitarian compromise. A conventional military siege might have included offers of term surrender, and the population would be spared resistance, would result in assault. Leningrad's population was never offered terms because Nazi ideology precluded it. They were condemned to death regardless of what they did. This guaranteed desperate resistance because there was literally nothing to lose. It also created international outrage that strengthened Allied resolve and provided powerful propaganda. The siege became a symbol of Nazi barbarism, evidence that Germany was not just a military enemy, but a moral abomination that had to be destroyed. Soviet propaganda used Leningrad brilliantly, images of starving children, stories of heroic resistance, accounts of civilian suffering. The siege strengthened Soviet morale across the entire nation and Allied support from Britain and America. The humanitarian catastrophe inside Leningrad defies comprehension. Over 1 million people died, most during the first winter when starvation was most severe. Families disappeared, parents died, children starved. Entire households were found frozen in apartments months after everyone inside had died. Cannibalism occurred, though, how often is disputed and probably exaggerated by German propaganda. What's undeniable is that people were reduced to conditions that destroyed all normal social organization. Trust broke down because anyone might be desperate enough to steal food. Black markets developed where bread sold for prices only the wealthy could afford. Corruption became endemic. Officials with access to food supplies hoarded or sold what should have gone to civilians. The Soviet state maintained control through terror. NKVD secret police shot looters, arrested black marketeers, executed anyone accused of defeatism or treason. The siege created a city where death was ordinary, where survival required daily miracles, where humanity was tested beyond any reasonable limit. That people survived at all is testament to resilience that transcends explanation. German casualties around Leningrad are often overlooked, but were substantial. Thousands of German soldiers died from combat cold disease and starvation. Yes, starvation, because German logistics couldn't always supply besieging forces adequately either. Frostbite disabled thousands more. German morale suffered because the siege offered no possibility of victory, only endless static defense, with no purpose beyond following Hitler's orders. Units that fought at Leningrad were later transferred to other sectors where their reduced effectiveness contributed to German defeats. The siege consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere: ammunition for bombardment fuel, for vehicles, food for troops, equipment for maintenance, all wasted on a siege that accomplished nothing strategically. If Army Group North had bypassed Leningrad and used its forces offensively elsewhere, might that have changed the war's outcome? Probably not, but it certainly couldn't have been worse than what actually happened. The strategic failure of the Siege of Leningrad is clear in retrospect. Germany committed massive forces to a siege that lasted 872 days and accomplished zero strategic objectives. Leningrad never surrendered. Its population never collapsed. Its factories continued producing weapons. Its symbolic importance to the Soviet Union remained intact. German forces tied down besieging the city could have been used elsewhere. Resources expended on bombardment and siege maintenance were wasted. The humanitarian catastrophe created propaganda victories for the Allies and strengthened Soviet resolve. There is no metric by which the Siege of Leningrad was a German success. It was failure on every level: military, strategic, morale. The siege should have worked according to conventional military logic, but it failed because war is not just military logic. War is also logistics, weather, human resilience, and moral calculation. Germany failed on all counts. Logistics doomed the siege because German supply lines couldn't sustain operations. Distance from supply bases, inadequate transport, competing priorities, and winter weather combined to create logistical collapse. German forces around Leningrad were perpetually undersupplied, unable to conduct sustained operations, forced into static defense because mobility was impossible. The Wehrmacht was designed for mobile warfare, but logistics limited them to siege warfare, where their advantages disappeared. This was the same problem Germany faced throughout the Eastern Front. Operational tempo exceeded logistical capacity. Forces advanced faster than supplies could follow, creating pockets of strength unsustainable over time. At Leningrad, this mismatch between capability and capacity became terminal. Weather was the equalizer that negated German advantages. Winter rendered German equipment useless, German tactics irrelevant, German superiority meaningless. Soviet forces were also affected by winter, but they were adapted to it culturally and materially. Soviet equipment was designed for winter use. Soviet soldiers were trained for cold weather operations. Soviet supply systems assumed winter conditions. German forces had none of these advantages and suffered accordingly. The winter of 1941–42 broke the German military's momentum across the entire Eastern Front, and at Leningrad specifically, it made the siege unwinnable. German forces couldn't advance in winter, couldn't assault fortified positions, couldn't do anything except try to survive until spring. Meanwhile, Soviet forces used winter to stabilize defenses, bring supplies across Lake Ladoga, prepare counter-offensives. Winter was strategically decisive at Leningrad in ways German planners never anticipated. Soviet resilience was the factor German ideology blinded them to. Nazi racial theories taught that Slavic peoples were inferior, that Soviet citizens would break under pressure, that communism was weak and would collapse when tested. All of this was ideological fantasy. Soviet citizens, particularly Leningrad's population, demonstrated resilience that exceeded anything in German historical experience. They endured conditions that should have broken human societies: mass starvation, constant bombardment, freezing temperatures, no hope of relief. And they didn't surrender. They didn't collapse. They kept fighting. This wasn't because Soviet communism was superior to Nazi fascism. It was because human beings, when given no alternative except fight or die, will fight. Leningrad's population fought because surrender meant death anyway. German ideology, by making extermination the explicit goal, ensured desperate resistance. A siege with humanitarian provisions might have succeeded. A siege explicitly designed for genocide created resistance that couldn't be broken. Nazi ideology's role in the siege's failure cannot be overstated. Hitler's order to destroy Leningrad, rather than capture it, meant German forces couldn't pursue any strategy except total siege. They couldn't negotiate. They couldn't accept partial surrender. They couldn't offer humanitarian terms. All they could do was maintain siege lines and hope starvation worked fast enough. This inflexibility was strategic suicide. Wars are won through flexibility, through adapting strategy to circumstances, through rational calculation of costs and benefits. Nazi ideology made rational calculation impossible because ideology demanded extermination regardless of cost. Leningrad became a monument to ideological warfare's failure. The city survived because Nazi Germany's commitment to genocide made compromise impossible, and without compromise, sieges can only succeed if defenders break. Leningrad's defenders never broke. The end came not from German decision, but Soviet power. By 1944, Soviet military strength had grown to the point where offensives could liberate besieged cities. Operation Iskra in January 1943 broke the siege, partially establishing the land corridor. The final liberation came in January 1944, when Soviet forces launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, driving German forces back 60 to 100 miles from the city. German Army Group North was forced to retreat to avoid encirclement. The siege was lifted not because German forces decided to withdraw, but because they were driven away by force. Leningrad had survived 872 days of siege bombardment, starvation, and death. Over 1 million people had died. The city was devastated, but it had survived, and Germany's most ambitious siege had failed completely. The Siege of Leningrad stands as evidence that military power has limits. Germany had overwhelming firepower, had numerical superiority in the siege's early stages, had every military advantage. None of it mattered. The siege failed because you cannot starve 3 million people into submission when they have nowhere to go and nothing to lose. It failed because logistics matter more than tactics. It failed because weather is a strategic factor that overwhelms military planning. It failed because human resilience exceeds theoretical predictions, especially when survival is the only alternative to extermination. And it failed because ideology that demands genocide cannot succeed when victims choose to resist, even at cost of death. These lessons are uncomfortable for military planners who prefer wars where material advantages determine outcomes. Leningrad proved that material advantages are necessary but insufficient. Victory requires logistical sustainability, strategic flexibility, adaptation to environmental factors, and moral legitimacy. Germany had none of these at Leningrad, and the siege failed despite 872 days of trying. The siege should have worked. Every military calculation suggested it would. 3 million people cannot survive without food. A city cut off from supplies must surrender eventually. Starvation is mathematically certain, but mathematics failed to account for human variables: courage, endurance, creativity, desperation. It failed to account for the road of life across Lake Ladoga, for factories producing weapons, when workers were dying of hunger, for soldiers holding positions while starving, for civilians enduring suffering that should have broken them. It failed to account for Soviet logistics getting just enough supplies into the city to prevent total collapse. It failed to account for winter turning the siege line into a frozen hell where German forces suffered as much as defenders. It failed to account for Nazi ideology making compromise impossible and thereby ensuring desperate resistance. All these factors combined to make Leningrad's survival possible and Germany's siege strategy impossible. The Siege of Leningrad should have been Germany's most cost-effective military operation, starve a city into submission without wasting troops on assault. Instead, it became one of Germany's greatest strategic failures, consuming resources, tying down armies, accomplishing nothing, and demonstrating that wars are not won by firepower alone. They are won by sustainability, by adaptation, by understanding that enemies are human beings who will resist when given no alternative. Nazi Germany understood none of this. They besieged Leningrad for 872 days, killed over 1 million people, destroyed a city, and accomplished nothing. That is the definition of strategic failure, maximum cost for zero gain. And the failure happened not because Germany didn't try hard enough or lacked commitment, but because the strategy was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. You cannot siege your way to victory when ideology demands extermination and logistics cannot support operations. The Siege of Leningrad proved that conclusively. The lesson remains relevant today.